Some lives are not simply forgotten, they are deliberately removed from history, their traces methodically erased by those who feared what their existence proved. When institutional power decides a person never should have lived as they did, every record becomes evidence of a crime that was never supposed to be discovered. What happens when the evidence survives anyway? This was not a prince who died young by chance. This was a man whose future was methodically dismantled because the wrong kind of desire had entered the record. His protection vanished first, then his reputation. Finally, the possibility that his name could safely remain in history as it once stood. What he lost was not only a crown, but the right to be explained honestly. The destruction did not announce itself. There was no public trial, no formal charge, no confession demanded. What disappeared instead was visibility. Files stalled, names blurred, attention shifted. The punishment was quiet, and therefore complete. For a royal system dependent on moral appearance, the exposure of forbidden male sexuality at the very center of succession was intolerable. By the time the scandal surfaced, the outcome had already been decided. This was not about proving guilt or innocence. It was about preventing inquiry. The moment the Cleveland Street investigation brushed too close to the line of inheritance, the machinery engaged, not to defend the man, but to protect the institution from him. Most of these sealed royal files only surface because enough people remain inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel, because once these doors close, they do not reopen. Only after the damage is visible does the identity matter. Prince Albert Victor was not a marginal figure, nor a disposable cousin. He was the direct heir to the British throne, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, positioned one heartbeat away from kingship. His value lay entirely in continuity. His danger lay in contradiction. Court correspondence from the period reflects unease long before any police file reached Whitehall. There were concerns about behavior, associations, and supervision, not crimes, risks. In a rigid moral hierarchy, suspicion itself carried weight. Once Cleveland Street entered official memoranda, those anxieties crystallized into threat. The Cleveland Street scandal was not, in itself, unique. Male prostitution existed. Police raids occurred. What made this case lethal was proximity. Witnesses, rent boys, and intermediaries were connected, not conclusively, but uncomfortably, to men of rank. The investigation moved upward instead of outward. That movement was stopped. Home Office records show hesitation where decisiveness was expected. Arrests proceeded selectively. Prosecutions narrowed. Certain names were omitted entirely. Others were permitted to leave the country. The law did not fail. It was redirected. What followed was a strategic narrowing of narrative. Illness replaced inquiry. Travel replaced testimony. Silence replaced explanation. The heir remained visible, but hollowed. The future he represented was quietly reassigned. By the time death arrived, it did not feel sudden. It felt convenient. And the most dangerous question, what exactly had been contained inside those files, was never allowed to be asked aloud. After the future was stripped away, the man remained, not as he had been intended to exist, but as a figure already under quiet correction. To understand why the system reacted as it did, it is necessary to examine who had been placed at risk, and why his presence inside the line of succession created such institutional alarm once suspicion attached to him. Prince Albert Victor was raised not to rule independently, but to embody continuity. From early adulthood, his value was symbolic: stability, marriage, heirs, moral reassurance. Court expectations did not require brilliance. They required conformity. In that context, deviation was not a private matter. It was a structural fault. Preserved correspondence from tutors and courtiers reveals a pattern of supervision that intensified rather than relaxed with age. Travel was arranged. Companions were selected. Appearances were managed. These measures were not punitive on paper, but they reflect an underlying assessment. He required oversight, not because he was incompetent, but because he was unpredictable in ways the institution could not afford. What emerges from the record is not a scandalous caricature, but a constrained figure whose movements were increasingly shaped by caution. He was sent abroad frequently. Engagements were discussed with urgency. Court memoranda emphasized the necessity of settlement, not happiness, but resolution. Marriage, in this framework, was less a personal milestone than a corrective strategy. This mattered because of timing. Albert Victor stood at the intersection of two pressures, a rigid moral climate and a fragile succession. The late Victorian monarchy was acutely sensitive to reputation. Public confidence depended on domestic virtue. Any suggestion of sexual irregularity at the level of heirship threatened not only personal standing, but the credibility of the crown itself. Within this environment, association became evidence. Proximity became suspicion. Once the Cleveland Street investigation began mapping networks of male intimacy across class lines, the danger was not that proof would emerge, but that attention would linger. For an heir, lingering inquiry was unacceptable. The archival trail shows careful repositioning rather than confrontation. When concerns surfaced, they were absorbed into private management. When rumors circulated, they were countered with visibility. When the risk increased, distance was introduced. Each step reduced exposure while preserving outward normalcy. What is striking is the absence of defense. No preserved document argues openly for Albert Victor's innocence. No official voice insists on vindication. Instead, the strategy appears to have been containment. Limit discussion, reduce contact, redirect scrutiny elsewhere. This was not mercy. It was risk management. By the time Cleveland Street entered the political bloodstream, Albert Victor was already being handled as a liability rather than a future sovereign. The question was no longer whether he could rule, but whether he could safely remain visible. And as the files would soon demonstrate, visibility itself had become the greatest danger. The building itself was unremarkable. A narrow London street, a respectable facade. Nothing in its brickwork announced the danger it posed. Yet within weeks of official attention, this address became the most volatile point of contact between private desire and public power in late Victorian Britain. The Cleveland Street House functioned as a male brothel, a fact preserved not in rumor, but in police depositions, trial transcripts, and Home Office memoranda. Telegraph boys, clerks, and working-class men sold sexual access to wealthier clients. Payments were modest, encounters brief. What made the operation explosive was not its existence, but its reach. When police intervened in 1889, they did not stumble into the case accidentally. An intercepted postal order, a dismissed employee, and routine inquiry opened a door. Investigators had no reason to expect would lead upward. Names began to surface. Not in court testimony at first, but in private notes exchanged between officials, suddenly aware that this was not a matter of street vice alone. Cleveland Street was dangerous because it collapsed distance. Class boundaries dissolved inside its rooms. Servants and aristocrats occupied the same register. In a society that relied on rigid separation, moral, social, sexual, this collapse was intolerable. The law could prosecute individual acts, but it could not safely illuminate the network. Police records show early momentum. Arrests were made, statements collected, charges prepared. Then the pace changed. Communications slowed. Jurisdictional uncertainty appeared where none had existed. Decisions were deferred upward, away from the courts and toward the administrative core of the state. At this point, the investigation ceased to belong to the police alone. Home Office involvement transformed it. The question was no longer how to apply the law, but how far it could be allowed to travel. Files show caution replacing procedure. The emphasis shifted from exposure to containment. One witness later noted that certain inquiries were quietly discouraged. Another record indicates that known participants were permitted to leave the country before formal charges could be issued. This was not incompetence, it was prioritization. The state weighed scandal against justice and chose discretion. What made Cleveland Street uniquely threatening was its timing. The monarchy's public image depended on moral authority at a moment when Republican sentiment simmered beneath the surface. A scandal touching the aristocracy was dangerous. A scandal brushing the line of succession was existential. Although no document names the heir directly, The pattern of suppression becomes legible when read alongside court correspondence and diplomatic traffic. The closer inquiry moved toward elite circles, the more resistance it encountered. The investigation did not collapse. It was redirected into safer channels. The address itself, Cleveland Street, became a liability. Discussion narrowed. Press coverage softened. Trials proceeded without context. The house remained. The implications were removed. And yet, the files persisted. Not all were destroyed. Some were sealed. Others survived in fragments, enough to suggest that what was stopped had not been resolved. The Crown could not control what happened inside that house, so it controlled what was allowed to be remembered about it. The most revealing aspect of the Cleveland Street affair is not what survives in the record, but where the record abruptly thins. Police files do not end with resolution. They end with interruption. Procedures that should have advanced instead stalled, and the cause of that stalling can be traced through internal memoranda that were never intended for public scrutiny. Once the investigation reached beyond street-level offenders, authority shifted. The matter passed from ordinary policing into administrative supervision. Correspondence shows the Home Office taking an increasingly active role, not to accelerate prosecution, but to regulate it. Decisions that would normally be routine were elevated, reconsidered, and delayed. This transition is documented. Arrest warrants prepared but not executed. Interviews postponed indefinitely. Jurisdictional questions raised where precedent already existed. The effect was cumulative. Momentum drained away without any formal order to stop. Silence emerged not as absence, but as policy. In surviving police notes, frustration is visible. Officers recorded leads they were instructed not to pursue. Certain names were excluded from written summaries. Others were referred to obliquely, stripped of identifying detail. What could not be erased outright was rendered unusable. One of the most striking patterns involves timing. Just as testimony began to suggest connections beyond the lower classes, communication between departments intensified, followed by rapid containment. Men identified as participants were quietly facilitated in leaving Britain. No extradition was sought. No effort was made to compel return. Departure functioned as closure. This was not an attempt to prove innocence. It was an effort to prevent accumulation. Evidence does not need to be false to be dangerous. It only needs to persist. The Home Office response indicates an acute awareness that continued inquiry risked destabilizing something far larger than a criminal case. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. The press, meanwhile, received a carefully managed version of events. Reporting focused on moral decay among the poor, not on elite participation. Court proceedings were framed narrowly. Names of higher status never appeared in print. This selective visibility ensured that scandal remained contained within acceptable social boundaries. What did not disappear were the files themselves. Portions were archived, others were sealed. Redactions became a language of their own. Gaps that signaled intervention more clearly than any annotation. Later access would reveal inconsistencies impossible to attribute to chance. The sudden silence surrounding Cleveland Street was therefore not a conclusion. It was a decision to subordinate law to stability, inquiry to continuity, and individuals to the preservation of institutional authority. And with that decision made, attention turned away from the files, toward the person whose proximity to them could never be safely explained. The most effective form of suppression is not destruction, but ambiguity. In the Cleveland Street affair, proof did not vanish entirely. It fractured. What survived did so unevenly. Partial letters, indirect testimony, and references stripped of context. The result was a record dense with implication yet resistant to final certainty. No personal confession survives. No explicit letter names the heir. This absence has often been misread as exoneration. Archival practice suggests the opposite. In cases where risk is existential, records are not preserved whole. They are rendered incomplete. What remains is enough to explain administrative behavior without exposing its cause. Preserved correspondence from the period contains a notable increase in coded language. References to undesirable associations, improper company, and necessary discretion recur without specification. These phrases appear across private letters, court memoranda, and diplomatic notes, a convergence that indicates shared understanding without written clarity. Testimony from lower-level participants was similarly constrained. Statements given to police were narrowed before reaching court. Names were replaced with descriptors, timelines blurred. The evidentiary chain was interrupted at multiple points, producing a legal narrative that could proceed without implicating anyone of rank. This is where proof becomes political. The absence of a signed letter does not negate concern. It explains response. Institutions do not mobilize at this level without reason. They mobilize to prevent accumulation, the slow, dangerous layering of corroboration. Later historians would note the pattern. Evidence clustered around the edges, never the center. Witnesses who could speak directly were removed from jurisdiction. Documents that might have connected disparate references were sealed. What survived did so as fragments, sufficient to signal intervention, insufficient to compel exposure. The problem of proof, then, is not whether something occurred. It is whether the system permitted confirmation. In the Cleveland Street case, the answer is visible in the architecture of the archive itself. Gaps align too neatly. Silences arrive too precisely. What can be said with certainty is this: the management of evidence mirrors the management of the individual. Both were contained. Both were redirected. Neither was allowed to resolve openly. And in the absence of proof, the institution gained what it needed most: deniability. But deniability is not innocence. It is a holding position, and it would not be enough to protect what came next. Once ambiguity had been secured, restraint gave way to urgency. The Cleveland Street affair no longer threatened exposure through evidence alone. It threatened endurance. What alarmed the institution was not what had already surfaced, but what might still emerge if time, testimony, or political change altered the balance of control. From this point forward, the response ceased to be legal and became existential. The British monarchy did not move as a single voice, yet its actions converged with remarkable coherence. Palace officials, senior civil servants, and political intermediaries began operating within a shared understanding. The line of succession could not withstand sustained scrutiny. Any prolonged inquiry, even one that failed, risked normalizing suspicion. That alone was intolerable. At the center of this anxiety stood Prince Albert Victor, not as a defendant or even a confirmed participant, but as a structural liability. His position transformed private concern into public danger. The institution did not require certainty to act. It required control. Court correspondence from this period shows a marked acceleration in plans that had previously moved slowly. Marriage negotiations intensified, framed less as personal fulfillment than as institutional repair. The production of a conventional domestic narrative became urgent. A settled air implied stability. Stability neutralized rumor. Simultaneously, visibility was recalibrated. Appearances were maintained, but carefully managed. Travel increased, not as privilege, but as distance. Foreign tours, temporary relocations, and extended absences reduced unsupervised exposure while preserving the illusion of normalcy. This balance, presence without access, reveals the depth of internal concern. What did not occur is as significant as what did. No public denial was issued, no legal clarification sought, no controlled disclosure attempted. Silence was not a failure of response. It was the response. To speak would have acknowledged the legitimacy of inquiry. To deny would have preserved it. The institution chose neither. Administrative records suggest that even informal discussion was discouraged. Certain subjects ceased to appear in writing. Meetings left no minutes. Decisions were implemented through implication rather than instruction. This was panic expressed through procedure, quiet, disciplined, and effective. The monarchy's authority depended on moral coherence. Any perception that the future sovereign existed outside acceptable norms risked collapsing that coherence retroactively. Past reigns, future stability, and national symbolism were all implicated. The individual became secondary to continuity, yet containment has limits. Each intervention increased pressure elsewhere. Each silenced question amplified private unease. What could not be resolved institutionally would eventually resolve itself by other means. And in this case, the most efficient resolution was not vindication, but removal. By the time institutional containment was fully in place, the public atmosphere had already begun to shift, not toward clarity, but toward rumor. The Cleveland Street affair entered Victorian consciousness not as a defined scandal, but as a haze of implication, whispered, distorted, and carefully starved of confirmation. This was not accidental confusion. It was cultivated uncertainty. Newspaper coverage from the period demonstrates a conspicuous restraint. Reports acknowledged arrests and moral concern, yet avoided names of consequence. Language remained abstract. Responsibility was localized among the expendable. The press did not investigate upward because it understood where inquiry would end. Editorial silence became a form of alignment. What circulated instead were fragments. Clubs murmured. Drawing rooms speculated. Parliament heard questions phrased carefully enough to require no answer. The absence of official acknowledgement created space for conjecture without consequence. Everyone sensed proximity to danger. No one could articulate it publicly. This environment produced what might be called controlled ignorance. The public was permitted to know that something improper had occurred, but not enough to challenge the integrity of the state. The narrative emphasized moral decline among the poor, thereby preserving the illusion of elite immunity. Scandal existed, safely misdirected. Court behavior reinforced this containment. Appearances by Prince Albert Victor were staged to project continuity. He remained visible, but carefully framed. Engagements suggested normal progression. Absence was explained as duty. Illness, when invoked, offered a language of sympathy rather than suspicion. Yet whispers persisted precisely because explanation was insufficient. The more tightly information was controlled, the more meaning attached to omission. Silence did not erase curiosity, it refined it. The public learned to read gaps, cancelled events, sudden departures, unexplained shifts, as signals. The Victorian press was not powerless. It was disciplined. Editors understood libel. They understood patronage. They understood the boundaries of survival. The result was a form of complicity that required no explicit instruction. The story was never killed. It was never allowed to grow. What little did reach print arrived stripped of context. Names without rank, acts without implication, outcomes without cause. Readers were invited to judge moral failure without access to structural truth. This preserved outrage while protecting hierarchy. As time passed, rumor hardened into background noise. The absence of confirmation exhausted attention. Scandal without climax loses energy. The institution relied on this fatigue. Public memory shortened. New distractions emerged. The unresolved became unremarkable. Then, abruptly, the whispers lost their object. With death, the narrative collapsed inward. Questions that could not be asked of the living could not be asked at all. Curiosity dissolved into mourning. Silence regained legitimacy. And the most dangerous form of ignorance settled permanently into place. The kind that feels like resolution, but is only absence with better manners. The official explanation arrived with deceptive simplicity. Illness, influenza, a sudden decline. In public terms, the death required no further scrutiny. It was familiar, tragic, and, most importantly, final. What months of administrative containment had not fully achieved, death accomplished instantly. When Prince Albert Victor died in January 1892, the Cleveland Street affair lost its gravitational center. The living body that anchored speculation was gone. With it, disappeared the practical possibility of testimony, clarification, or contradiction. Questions that could not be safely answered were rendered obsolete. The institutional response to his death was swift and revealing. Mourning protocols activated immediately. Public grief was encouraged. The narrative shifted decisively from concern to reverence. Obituaries emphasized duty, promise, and personal gentleness. There was no space left for ambiguity. Death had simplified the story. In archival terms, this was closure without resolution. Files were not reopened. Investigations were not reviewed. On the contrary, the need for review vanished. The problem the institution had labored to manage no longer existed. Succession adjusted seamlessly. The future moved on. What makes this moment historically significant is not the death itself, but its effect. Risk evaporated. Pressure dissipated. Silence acquired moral legitimacy. To question the circumstances now risked appearing indecent. Inquiry became disrespect. Administrative correspondence from the period reflects this recalibration. Attention turned elsewhere. Concerns that had dominated private discussion vanished from record. The sudden quiet was not the product of satisfaction, but of relief. The danger had passed, without exposure. Illness functioned as a narrative solvent. It dissolved suspicion without addressing it. The explanation required no corroboration because it asked for none. Influenza was plausible. Mortality was universal. The institution did not need certainty, only acceptance. This pattern was not unprecedented. Death had long served as the most efficient mechanism for scandal containment. Unlike acquittal, it did not invite debate. Unlike denial, it did not provoke contradiction. It closed the system by removing its point of tension. What followed was deliberate memorialization. Statues were planned, portraits circulated, character assessments softened. Memory was curated to replace unease with loss. The man who had represented risk was transformed into a symbol of interrupted promise. Yet death did not erase the archive. It froze it. The files remained, sealed, fragmented, unresolved. The absence of the subject did not clarify the record. It stabilized its ambiguity. What could not be proven could no longer be tested. In this sense, death was not an ending. It was an administrative solution. And as with all such solutions, it left behind a residue. Unanswered questions, preserved precisely because the one person who might have unsettled them was no longer there to do so. The closing of a life did not close the files. It only changed how they could be approached. What remains of the Cleveland Street affair exists not as a single dossier, but as a dispersed archive. Fragments preserved across police records, Home Office papers, court proceedings, and later releases that reveal as much through omission as through content. When portions of these materials became accessible decades later, their condition was instructive. Pages were missing, names were excised, margins carried unexplained markings, cross-references led to files that no longer existed. This was not the erosion of time alone. It was the residue of intervention. Researchers encountered an archive shaped by intent. Police statements survive, but not in full sequence. Administrative correspondence appears without attachments it explicitly references. Trial transcripts record outcomes without preserving the investigative pathways that produced them. The structure of the record communicates its own history of management. What is particularly striking is the consistency of redaction across institutions. Documents originating from different offices display similar absences. This alignment suggests coordination rather than coincidence. When multiple custodians remove the same kinds of detail, the result is a coherent silence. Later historians, working from these materials, were careful in their language. They did not claim proof where none survived. Instead, they documented patterns, the sudden cessation of inquiry, the facilitated departures of key figures, the disproportionate involvement of senior officials. These patterns do not resolve ambiguity, they explain behavior. In this sense, the archive functions as forensic evidence of suppression. The gaps are not empty, they are shaped. They reveal what the institution found intolerable to preserve. Absence becomes data. The surviving records also permit comparison. Similar strategies appear in other royal scandals involving sexuality, succession, or moral transgression. Investigations narrow, files fragment. Resolution coincides with disappearance. The Cleveland Street case conforms to this architecture with precision. What the archive still contains, therefore, is not confession, but instruction. It teaches how power responds when exposure threatens continuity. It demonstrates that proof is not always the objective. Control is. The presence of the files matters because they resist closure. Each release, however partial, reintroduces the question that death postponed. Why was so much effort required to manage something that officially never existed? Archives do not accuse, they persist. They wait for conditions under which they can be read without consequence. The Cleveland Street papers have waited more than a century, not to tell a complete story, but to show how stories are prevented from forming. What remains is enough to establish a pattern, enough to unsettle inherited narratives, and enough to confirm that erasure was not accidental. And patterns, once recognized, do not stay confined to a single case. What ultimately distinguishes the Cleveland Street affair is not its secrecy, but its familiarity. When examined alongside other suppressed royal scandals, its contours are unmistakable. The mechanisms repeat. The language recurs. The outcomes align. This was not an anomaly. It was a method. Across European monarchies, cases involving forbidden male desire follow a consistent institutional logic. Surveillance precedes accusation. Evidence accumulates only to be interrupted. Administrative authority replaces legal process. Visibility is recalibrated. Then, abruptly, the subject disappears through exile, forced conformity, or death. The system resolves risk by removing the individual rather than addressing the truth. The Cleveland Street files demonstrate this pattern with unusual clarity because of what survived. The silences are too precise, the interventions too coordinated, the relief following removal too evident. These are not the marks of confusion, they are the marks of practiced containment. What makes these cases difficult to confront is not lack of documentation, but the nature of what documentation reveals. Power rarely records its own motives. Instead, it leaves behind procedural distortions, delays, redactions, vanished attachments. Over time, these distortions form a recognizable signature. In this context, Prince Albert Victor becomes legible not as an isolated figure, but as part of a continuum. His erasure echoes earlier and later cases where male sexuality collided with dynastic necessity. The Crown did not invent this response for him. It applied a familiar solution. This continuity matters because it reframes historical innocence. The absence of proof has long been used to dismiss inquiry. Yet when absence is systematically produced, it ceases to be neutral. It becomes evidence of design. These stories persist because archives persist. However fragmented, they outlast reputational management. Each partial release weakens the illusion of accident. Each recovered memorandum restores pressure to questions long deferred. The goal of revisiting these files is not to impose certainty where it cannot exist. It is to restore proportion, to acknowledge that silence was not benign, that dignity was preserved at the cost of truth, and that institutional survival repeatedly required the quiet sacrifice of individual lives. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file, because once the pattern is visible, it cannot be unseen. And the archive does not end here.